As part of this process, I want to do a series of teaching over the next couple months on the church, to just take this opportunity to remind us about the hope of the church, the mission of the church, what God has given us as a church, some of the images the Bible uses. The church is a family, the church is a body. We'll talk about serving, learning how to build relationships with one another. I'm going to just talk about what it means to be a church. A church is a group of people. Many of you know that. The Greek word for church literally means called out ones. We always use it commonly in reference to a building. Well, that's not so bad. You got to call the building you meet in something. Might as well call it a church. But church is people. It's a group of individuals. So I thought it would be appropriate for the next 3 weeks to talk about leadership in the church. Across all of the chapel campuses, we're ultimately recommending to the members of the church that we move to install elders, local elders, from among each church for each church. So I thought it would be appropriate for us to consider leadership in the church. Now, we're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 5, so you can find your way there. I'll show you the verses on the screen if you didn't have a Bible, although I would always encourage you to bring a Bible. If you don't have one, we have free Bibles on the back table there. It's good to have it yourself, to see it for yourself, to spend time with God in a Bible. Lest you imagine for this morning and then the next couple of weeks, we're just going to learn about leadership in the church. For the elders, in a church our size, it's only going to be a handful of people. And most of you don't desire to be an elder, aren't interested, so okay, great. We're going to do 3 weeks of sermons that will apply to like 8 people. And maybe over the course of a decade, 8 times a number of years, okay, great, 20 people, and we're going to do all kinds of sermons on that. Here's what I would encourage you to consider. Not only is there a part of knowing what you ought to look for in an elder in a church, that's a legitimate thing. The Bible lays out criteria. You also ought to have expectations of what an elder ought to be like. This morning we're going to talk about the heart of an elder. Like, there is an expectation, there is a standard. We should keep elders to that standard. But what I would encourage you to also have in your mind, maybe you weren't aware of this, the heart of an elder that we'll consider this morning is the heart of every follower of Jesus. So it ought to be the heart, the core, the center, the controlling passions of an elder should be the same for any follower of Jesus. And then next Sunday, when we consider the character of an elder, the spiritual maturity of an elder, the expectation of Christ for the maturity of all of his followers is the same, whether you're an elder or you're not, whether you're a leader in the church or not. The character and maturity of an elder should be the same as every follower of Jesus. What is most substantively different, we'll consider the third week, that's the responsibilities of an elder. What do they actually do? So as we consider this morning the heart of an elder, yes, consider qualified men in our church that could be elders. Consider our staff as leaders. Consider me as a pastor. Do I satisfy these things? But also consider, like, God, is this true of my heart? Okay, so this is 1 Peter chapter 5. We'll read together verses 1 through 5, and then we'll consider them together this morning. This is written by Peter, thus the letter has his name. He's writing to churches in modern-day Turkey, called Asia Minor then, and they are experiencing significant suffering and persecution and hardship. And Peter is writing them a letter of encouragement. And he's going to present what I'm calling the heart of an elder, but he does so through 3 contrasts. So as we read this, see if you can begin to get a feel for the heart of an elder and see if you can find or hear the 3 contrasts. This is God's word. So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. If you had to pick one word to describe the heart of a follower of Jesus, one word to describe the heart of an elder, what are some of the words that come to your mind? I'm picking the word humble. I think the heart of an elder, the heart of every follower of Jesus, ought to be a heart that is humble. I want to show you some of the ways that I think Peter, even in the way he introduces this subject, is actually demonstrating humility. He begins that he exhorts, he says, so I exhort the elders among you. All right, audience participation time by show of hands. Raise your hand if you have any time in the last month used the word exhort in a sentence. It's okay if you did. Okay. Exhort. It means to earnestly encourage. There's more emotion in it, more passion, more energy behind it than just saying encourage. Like, hey, if you're going to think about having elders, I would encourage you to think about this. That would just be encourage. Exhort is like, hey, because you should have elders, you really need to do this. I plead with you. I appeal to you. I spur you on. I beg you. Come on. This is what he says. I exhort you. I plead with you. I earnestly encourage you. Now, he's going to describe himself a little bit as a fellow elder. Now, for those of you who are new to the Bible and new to the people in the Bible, this will be educational to you. For many of you who are familiar with people in the Bible, Peter is one of the most well-known because he has had some incredibly high moments in his life and some utterly wretched moments that we are all grateful it was Peter who did that and not us. Now, Peter is a real person who lived at a real time. He wrote a real letter to individuals in real circumstances. This is personal for Peter. When Peter sat down to write this letter, I don't believe he said, I better be very careful with my words because I am writing the Bible. I am sitting down right now, I'm writing the Bible, and I need to make sure I write things down that 2,000 years from now will be relevant to a whole bunch of Americans gathering in Wadsworth, Ohio for a church service. He's just writing a letter to churches, probably small churches, who are experiencing significant opposition for their faith in Jesus. And he wants to spur them on, and he wants to address the elders, the leaders of their church, and he is describing to them what the heart of an elder looks like, and he identifies himself to them as a fellow elder. Now, for those of you who know the Bible, think with me now about Peter, a real person, lived at a real time, had real life experiences. More than an elder of a local church, what was Peter? An apostle. One of the disciples, one of the very first in Jesus' own inner circle, and yet he identifies himself as a fellow elder. A mark of humility is you're not putting forward your credentials, your qualifications, your position. You lower yourself. And so Peter introduces himself as a fellow elder, not bringing up his qualification as an apostle or one of the first, though he is both of those things. And then he says, a witness of the sufferings of Christ. A fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ. Think, what are some of the other things that Peter witnessed? Far more impressive, far more credentialed than having witnessed the sufferings of Jesus. Think for a minute of Peter's life. Peter witnessed miracles. Peter was called to follow Jesus after Jesus performed a miracle of filling a net with fish after Peter, who's a fisherman, was up all night and didn't catch anything. What else did Peter witness of Jesus? How many times did Peter witness Jesus give someone blind sight? Or someone who couldn't hear the ability to hear? Or someone who couldn't walk the ability to walk? And yet that's not what Peter says he witnessed. What else? Come on, those of you who know the life of Peter. What else did Peter get to witness? Remember on the mountain, what we now call the Transfiguration, Jesus is glorified, physically glorified somehow in the presence of just 3 of the disciples, Peter and James and John. And Moses is there. I don't know how that happened. And Elijah is there. And they're 3 men. Peter is one of only 3 human beings in the world. Well, Jesus is a human being. Moses is Elijah. They're human beings too. Okay. He's one of 6 human beings in the world that was there that day. And he doesn't mention that he saw that. But what does he mention he's a witness of? The sufferings of Jesus. What's he talking about when he refers to the sufferings of Jesus? What massive event in human history is he referring to? The crucifixion of Jesus. Peter says he's a witness to the crucifixion of Jesus. Okay, now this is where I think humility in Peter really comes to the surface. What kind of witness was Peter of the crucifixion of Jesus? A terrible one, a faithless one, a prideful one. Right? On the way to the crucifixion, Jesus tells all of his followers, including Peter, you guys are all going to fall away from me this night. You're all going to abandon me. And what does Peter say? Jesus, clarification, no. These fellas might. I will not. Jesus, simmer down, Sweet Pete. I wonder what he called him. I imagine he had a nickname for him. Maybe it wasn't Sweet Pete, but he probably had a nickname for him. No, Peter, you're not. Jesus is corrected by Peter, and Peter says, I am willing to go with you to death. I will follow you even to death. You're not. Actually, Peter, this night, you're actually going to 3 times deny me even before morning comes. And Peter's like, I am not going to. Okay. So then Jesus in the garden, now he's being arrested. Many of you know what Peter Dud had some courage in that moment. They approach him, and Peter's about to prove that he can go anywhere Jesus can go. Right? Isn't that what he's saying? Jesus, you think I'm going to fall away. I'm telling you I'm not. I am made of some serious stuff. I am brave. I am tough. I am committed. I love you no matter what. I can go wherever you go, and I'm gonna. And the soldiers come up, and they come to arrest Jesus. Peter unsheathes his sword, and then the fisherman, who is not a trained swordsman, flails that thing around, misses the head, and lands on the ear. And then Jesus corrects him. Put your sword back in its place, and he heals the man's ear who'd been cut off. And then at that time, Jesus moves towards the high priest's house for his trial, and the Bible tells us, the gospel writers tell us, that Peter, he's now following at a distance. Peter completely loses his courage. I imagine Peter is completely devastated, humiliated, embarrassed. And then now he's in the courtyard of the high priest while Jesus is under trial. And now Peter, who a few minutes ago was brave enough to go to war with King Jesus, now denies that he even knows Jesus to a slave girl who says, hey, weren't you with them? Nope, wasn't. You know the story. 3 times he denies that he even knows Jesus. This is how much of a witness of the sufferings of Jesus Peter was. And then the gospel writers tell us Peter denies the 3rd time, the rooster crows, and whose eyes meet Peter's? Jesus's. And says Peter went out and he wept bitterly. So why in the world is Peter moving to earnestly plead with the elders, bringing to their mind the heart that they ought to have as an elder, and introducing the subject by referring to himself as one who witnessed the sufferings of Jesus. I think in part because a man of humility, a woman of humility, a heart of humility in every follower of Jesus is honest and forthright about their sin. I also think it's because by this time in Peter's life, this brother is powerful, influential, and incredibly well known. And the churches get a letter from Peter. They probably don't need any help being reminded of what Peter did at Pentecost and what Peter has done for the followers of Jesus. Peter's famous by now, and we all know, we experience this in our culture in spades. We love to worship celebrities. We love to praise people for the good things they do, especially spiritually. If there are people that you appreciate for their spiritual modeling and their example, we love to lift them up and honor them. And Peter lowers himself. So he's a witness of the sufferings of Christ. As well, he goes on to say, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. I find this so compelling. Humility in your heart says that you are willing to be aware of your sin. You're willing to discuss your sin. You don't have to defend yourself against your sin. You don't have to be defensive. You don't have to pretend like it never happened. You can be aware of your sin and so confident that you are a future partaker in the glory that's going to be revealed, that these two things can exist together. Humility is not, oh, I am such a sinner. I've been struggling with this for years and years and years. I'm just a sinner. I'm just one poor sinner trying to help other poor sinners find a little bit of help. I'm a sinner, 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 sinner. That's only true of you if you have never come to faith in Christ. A heart of humility has an awareness and can talk about your sin with the confident courage that you are secure in Christ, that you are a partaker in what is yet to come. This is not arrogance in Peter. This is confidence in light of who Jesus is and what he has done. I read recently the distinction between arrogance and confidence is humility. So Peter is a witness of the sufferings of Jesus, though a pretty horrible one he proved to be initially. And he is confident that he is a partaker in what is to come. Is this true of your heart as a follower of Jesus? A heart of humility. And then in verse 2, he begins to give the instruction. He says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight. Shepherd the flock. These are the very words that Jesus told him. We'll consider in a few minutes the story of when Jesus restored Peter. But that was the same instruction Jesus gave him. Okay, so now here's three contrasts that are going to describe the heart of an elder. The first contrast deals with willingness. Do you want to? So he says, shepherd the flock that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly. This speaks to volition. Do you want to? Ask yourself, as a follower of Jesus, wouldn't it be inappropriate and not make very much sense if you followed Jesus because you had to? Jesus, I don't really want to follow you, but I have to. I don't really want to be an elder in the church, but I have to. No, willingly. Does an elder willingly want to serve? But if you're a follower of Jesus, when you find yourself not willing, well, that is an indicator that my heart is getting off here, because that's a problem. The one who doesn't want to willingly follow Jesus is losing sight of many things. An elder ought to be one who is absolutely willing. Paul says in 1 Timothy, here's a trustworthy saying, if anyone aspires to the office of overseer, elder, shepherd, pastor, he desires a noble task. Do you want to follow Jesus? An elder ought to want to. I had the privilege of beginning to explore vocational ministry or being a pastor or on the path to being an elder many years ago at the chapel in Akron. I had been involved in ministry on campus at the University of Akron with other men on the football team and with the church, and it was bearing fruit, and people began to suggest to me maybe I should pursue training to be a pastor. I had before that felt like a calling from God to be a pastor, so I started pursuing training to explore this. And during that program, one of the pastors at the chapel, his name is Jay Halley, is a wonderful man, was a great encouragement to me and an influence to me. He's now a pastor in Sandusky. He described the willingness of a pastor this way. He said, if you can imagine yourself doing anything else, go do that. A pastor ought to be willing. An elder ought to be willing. A follower of Jesus ought to be willing. Want to. That's the first contrast. Want to. However, even when you want to, there are plenty of reasons, plenty of motives to want to that are just not good. So the next contrast addresses motive. Not for shameful gain, he says at the end of verse 2, but eagerly. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly. This is addressing greedy or selfish motives or dishonest or unfair practices. Now, it is all too common, I think, for there to be pastors in churches that are in it for the wrong reason, for selfish gain, materially, financially, or otherwise. The problem isn't gain itself. There's nothing wrong with a pastor. Nice of me to say so. There's nothing wrong with a pastor to be compensated by his church. Lavishly. Oh, that part I made that up. The scriptures affirm it's absolutely appropriate. Paul says in 1 Timothy, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor. Don't just pay the pastor your respects, actually pay the brother, is what this is saying. Now, the Apostle Paul, he set that right aside, but he made it abundantly clear, I have a right to be supported by the church. However, he set it aside so that nobody could accuse him of shameful gain. I would love to set that right aside, except for I have mouths to feed at home and a wife. So if you wouldn't mind me being paid, so there are paid elders and there are unpaid elders. I imagine in our church moving forward, we will have more unpaid elders or lay elders or volunteer elders than we do paid elders. There's nothing wrong with an elder being paid. It's for unjust gain, greedy gain, selfish gain. And unfortunately, you have all heard stories and seen this played out. At the same time, I don't believe by a long shot that represents the majority of pastors. I think the vast majority of pastors, that isn't true of, but there are certainly many bad examples. Okay, so not for shameful gain, I get that, but how is eagerly, think about it, how is eagerly the contrast to not for shameful gain? Okay, go with me to Peter's life experience. After he fell on his face, after Jesus went to the cross, after Jesus was resurrected. Now, sometime after that, Peter and a handful of the disciples, I think there's like 5 or 6 of them, they go fishing. They're out all night fishing, and they pitch a shutout. They don't catch a single fish. They're coming back to the shore. They see somebody on the shore that they don't know it's Jesus yet, but they see a person on the shore. This person calls out to them, hey, throw your net on the right side of the boat. So they do. I think it's interesting that Jesus performs again a very similar miracle from when he called Peter the first time. They fill the net with so many fish. One of the Gospels even numbers the fish, 153. A lot of fish. Peter hears John say, it's Jesus. So Peter's all excited that now Jesus is on the shore. Peter puts on his outer clothing. Now he's in a boat fishing. So he's like in his work clothes. He's in his underwear fishing. And he's like, ooh, I better put my shirt on if I'm going to go see Jesus. I don't know if Peter's really thinking super clearly, but he puts on his outer cloak. And then he jumps in the water to get to the shore faster. I would have thought you'd just leave the thing in the boat and have him bring it with you. But he's super excited to see Jesus. So Jesus brings up them on shore. And then he begins to take Peter through what I think was an absolutely excruciating and healing restoration. Now they're all together on the shore, and Jesus begins to examine Peter. Many of you are familiar with this event in history. And Jesus asks Peter, what does he ask Peter? Peter, do you... humor me. Come on now. Anybody. He says, Peter, do you... All right, that's much more encouraging. Peter, do you love me? Peter says, yes, Lord. Yes, you know that I love you. And what does Jesus tell him? Feed my sheep. Interesting. This is the instruction Peter's giving to these elders. Feed my sheep. Second time, Jesus asks him, Peter, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Tend my sheep. Third time now, and this is where it gets painful. Come on, these are real people. Peter is sitting around some of the very men that he completely threw shade on, as we say now, before Jesus' death. These men may leave you, I will not. How do you think that went over with them? And now here Peter is, his failure on full display, and Jesus sticking his finger in it. And now he asks them a third time, Peter, do you... Peter says, Lord, you know all things. And this is when I imagine this being like really brutally difficult for Peter. You know all things, Lord. You know I was full of myself. You know I thought I could do it just like you. You knew I thought I was as courageous, as faithful, as tough. You know all that about me. Everybody knows that about me. But you also know, Jesus, there isn't anything I wouldn't give if I could do that differently. I wish I understood. I wish I knew. I am so sorry. You were right. Jesus, you know all things. You know that I love you. And then what does Jesus say to him? Feed my sheep. And then he asks Peter to follow him. The opposite, I think, what Peter is teaching, the opposite of your motivation for being an elder, for following Jesus for some kind of selfish gain, is love. Before an elder feeds and tends to the sheep, love is the motivation. Love from God, love for God, love of God's people. An elder ought to be one that is marked by love. That's no different than the humble heart of any follower of Jesus. That's no different than the humble heart of any leader in any position. Many of you, God has given positions of leadership, either in your home, in the community, in your circles, around you. Leadership ought to be marked first by love. And this is what Peter, I believe, is exhorting these fellow elders to do, to love. And where there is love, I think there is also joy. An elder, being eager, is motivated by love and is motivated by joy. There is a wonderful tension that exists. Jesus, he says, on one hand, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. I'm gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. Sign me up for some of that. I could use some easy and light. Just wonderful. But Jesus also said, hey, shooting you straight. Anybody who wants to follow me, you got to take up your cross and follow me. Wait a minute. What about all that easy and light stuff you were talking about? The burden is easy and it's light. And you have to take up a cross and carry it? Which one is it? It's both. And isn't this what Jesus did? So Jesus, the scriptures say, for the joy set before him, endured the cross. Jesus was a joyful shepherd, eager to do it, though it was brutally difficult at many points. The Apostle Paul says a very similar thing. He says in the scriptures, daily he wrestles with his burden, his anxieties, his burdens for the churches. And yet at the same time, he says that he has no greater joy than seeing his children walk in the truth. These exist together. The heart of a shepherd is motivated by love and by joy. Think about the places where you lead and have responsibility. What kind of leadership can you give if you don't love? And how will people whom you are over, how will they ever believe or see your love if there is no joy? These two go together, love and joy. The third contrast, I think, brings it to immediate practical application. The third contrast, Peter says this, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples. Not domineering. Scriptural words that overlap with domineering. Violent is one, not just physically violent, violence in a broader sense. Harsh, bully, lord over, dominate. In our phrasing, we would think about someone who throws their weight around. A person who tends to be greedy for power and influence. A person who delights in their position and reminding you of it. A person eager to use their authority for their own interests. A person interested in increasing, preserving, coalescing power for their selfish purposes ought not ever to be. Even our culture knows that is a diseased form of leadership. It not ought to exist anywhere, but it does. It for sure ought not to exist in an elder. Sometimes it does. Not domineering. The opposite. Biblical words, opposite of domineering. Gentle, lowly, meek, humble, quiet. This is the spirit of Jesus and is the heart of an elder. In Ezekiel, there's a really compelling, startling rebuke that God gives to elders over the flock of God that are domineering. This is the prophet Ezekiel. He says, the word of the I am, Yahweh, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, even to the shepherds, thus says the Lord God, shepherds of Israel who have been feeding yourselves. Should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat. You clothe yourselves with the wool. You slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep. The weak you have not strengthened. The sick you have not healed. The injured you have not bound up. The strayed you have not brought back. The lost you have not sought. And with force and harshness you have ruled them. It not ought to be. Not in any sphere that you have responsibility to lead. Not in a parent over a child. Not in a boss over an insubordinate. In no place does the Spirit of God call those in positions of leadership to dominate over those under their care. And yet in a fallen world, is that not what we find in our hearts? in positions where God has entrusted you to lead, where God has given you authority and power over another person, are you telling me you have never noticed in your heart a tendency and a desire to misuse that power, to misuse that authority? I would suggest to you, you're being naive about the darkness that exists in your own heart. We say, and it's a fact, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there is only one human being in the history of the world that is false of. That's Jesus of Nazareth. So the prophet Isaiah says, "Behold, the Lord God comes with might." You want to talk about power? God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. He will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with young. In reference to Jesus Christ. There is a temptation for every elder, every pastor, I would add to that, every person in a position of leadership to misuse the power, the authority, the influence that is by necessity given to them for the benefit of the people that are under their charge, to use that for themselves. This is what is so astounding about Jesus, who, though being in very nature God, didn't consider his equality with God a thing to be leveraged for his own advantage, but he made himself nothing. He lowered himself in humility, taking on human flesh, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Jesus is the only one. Verse 4. We'll finish with this. "And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory." The elder whose heart is humility, who serves the church willingly, motivated by love and joy, who serves as an example, in the example of Jesus, well looks forward to an unfading crown of glory. Jesus is the chief shepherd. He's the example. So every elder, every under shepherd does well to remind themselves regularly they are first a sheep. They are first a sheep in need of a great shepherd. The only way that you can be an example as an elder is to be among the people, with the people. This is one of the primary reasons why leaders of the chapel, our lead pastors and our trustees, agree that a way that we need to move our governance towards a more biblical model is that shepherds, elders, overseers, they're all synonyms, we'll talk about that in the coming weeks, are among the people and from them to be an example, to be known, to be seen, and to be an example after the service of Jesus. Jesus, who washed the feet of his disciples after they fought about who was going to be the greatest. That is just astounding. The disciples are fighting about their power, their influence, their authority after Jesus dies, even before Jesus died. They didn't even wait to fight over the inheritance until Jesus was dead. They started fighting about it in his presence. And then Jesus washes their feet. This is the example of service that Jesus gave. This is what it means to be an example. When the chief shepherd appears, Jesus says in John chapter 10, "I am the good shepherd." All leadership, all shepherding in the church ought to be consistent with the example of Jesus. He is the good shepherd. Only he lays down his life for the sheep. The one who is a hired hand, Jesus said, and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. The wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd who said, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly heart, and I will give you rest for your souls." The heart of an elder in the church is the same heart of humility that God desires to form in every one of his followers. The motivation to know God, it should be the same. The motive of love and joy for an elder should be the same motivation for all the followers of Christ. The heart of humility is what God desires for us. And there are men in our church that I imagine have come to your mind, even as we have talked about this morning. Because men like this, even when they don't have the title of elder, these qualities are known about them, because they live as examples among the people. And my guess is, as you, over the coming weeks and months, think of men in our church that would be well chosen as elders, you will find yourself thinking about men that you know to be humble. Not men who walk around saying, "Hey, I just wanted to let you know, I'm really humble. Just wanted you to know that. My name's Zach, you can just call me humble." Men that you know as humble. Men that you see are motivated by joy, by love. And in so doing, all of us will become together a church that is increasingly honoring and pleasing to the Lord. Let me pray for us. I'll give you a moment to pray. Father, help us think about these things as you would have us think. Let's just take a moment and just process these things. Pray as the Spirit leads you, and as the band is ready to lead us, and when the time is right, we'll close our service with a song together. Just take time and pray as the Spirit would lead you.
This has been a message from the chapel. Thanks for joining us today. For more information about the chapel or any of our campuses, including Akron, Greene, Wadsworth, Kenmore, Cuyahoga Falls, Nordonia, and Medina, please go to our website at thechapel.life.